Hey, please help me welcome our speaker for the morning, Palomar Observatory docent, great friend, Mike Bertin. It's good to see you, and thank you for taking time to talk to us today about Galileo's finger. Mike Bertin is a 1963 graduate of MIT. He holds a PhD in nuclear physics from Rutgers University and was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford University. His career path includes basic research, industrial R&D, and entrepreneurship. Now retired, he's an amateur astronomer, a member of the Orange County Astronomers, and a docent at Palomar Observatory since October 2004. Michael, if you're going for 20 years here to get a pension, you know, the pension is even better than the salary. Okay? Something to look forward to. With that, we'll do questions at the end. I'll ask everybody to mute themselves during the presentation. And right now, Michael, thank you again. And please, the floor is yours.
Okay. So, I'm not sure how to do the screen sharing, Steve. We practiced this, but I don't see it up here. Can you see the Galileo's finger, the first slide here?
No, you
No.
screen share down on the bottom.
Okay, screen share down at the bottom.
Should be green.
Green, I don't see it.
Green button right in the center at the bottom.
Right in the middle.
Share screen. Okay. How about that?
There we go.
Okay. Let's put this on slideshow.
And we got your first slide.
Okay. So my name is Mike Bertin, as you've been told here. And today I'm going to tell you the Galileo story. And of course, you all know the Galileo story. Anybody who's on this Zoom call here knows the Galileo story, but I'm going to tell you some details about the story that maybe you haven't heard before. And the story starts, let's see how I can get rid of that here. Okay, no. The story starts really in 1439, when Gutenberg uses movable type in printing in Europe. And the importance of this is now that people in different parts of Europe, in Heidelberg, in Rome, in Paris, and London, they can all read the same ideas without it being interpreted by the government or by the church. So that's the beginning of the story. And then the next step in the story is 1543. Copernicus publishes De Revolutionibus. And Copernicus he knew that this might get him in trouble with the Catholic Church. And so he literally published, actually his wife made the publication on his deathbed. And De Revolutionibus sort of talked about a heliocentric, that is a sun-centered solar system. This was really not a new idea. Aristarchus had proposed a sun-centered solar system back in 270 BC, but it didn't gain traction. The church talked about a geocentric solar system that is centered on the Earth. So, but when Copernicus publishes this book, it's kind of obscure. It isn't actually placed on the church's list of banned books until 1616. So that's the second step. And then the next step is 1564 in the story. Is this little screen sharing bar, is that on the screen for everybody, or is it just for me? Maybe it's just for me. So the year is 1564. Michelangelo dies. And in 1564, in Pisa, Galileo is born, and his parents are Vincenzo Galilei and Giulia Amananti. And Vincenzo, that is Galileo's father, he's a well-known local lute player, but like struggling musicians today, his day job is that he's a cloth merchant. He needs a day job in order to make a living and feed his family. And Galileo is named for a kind of a 14th century patriarch of the family named Galileo Bonaiuti. He was a doctor. He was sort of the family hero, and the family changed his name to Galilei to honor this doctor. So that's 1564. In 1564, Shakespeare is born in Stratford-on-Avon in England. And 1564 is a very, very busy year. It's a busy year. Lots of stuff going on here. And then I should have made these bars bigger, but the details aren't terribly important. Galileo is in Pisa from 1581 to 1585. Then he's in Pisa again from 1589 to 1592. Later on, he's in Padua from 1592 to 1610. And finally, he's in Florence. In 1616, Shakespeare dies. He's only 52 years old. In 1642, Galileo dies in Arcetri, in his villa across the Arno River from Florence. In 1642, Newton is born. And there are some people that like to sort of see a progression. Michelangelo to Galileo, Galileo to Newton, maybe reincarnation. That, of course, would be heresy for a Catholic. So in 1727, Newton dies, and in 1737, Galileo is buried in the Santa Croce Church in Florence. And what are some things we know about Galileo? Well, we know about the swinging lamp in the Pisa Cathedral, dropping weights from the Leaning Tower, floating bodies in the hydrostatic balance, development of the telescope. Here are some of Galileo's astronomy discoveries. He tried to explain the tides, but his explanation was wrong. He advocated for the heliocentric system. He got in trouble with the church, etc., etc. These are all the things that most of us know about Galileo. I'm mostly not going to talk about those things. I'm going to talk about this time of Galileo's life that's in pink here, his time in Pisa and Padua, and then the time after he dies. Time after he dies is interesting. So I'm going to see if I can get rid of this bar here. Yeah, okay, good. So here's a statement that's made in 1581 in Italy, that you can't rely on just the weight of authority, for example, Aristotle's authority, without being able to question authority, and to, if you're in search of the truth, you need to question authority. That was true in the 16th century, and it's true today. Now, you might think this is a statement made by Galilei, but it's not. It's made by, why am I having trouble here? It's made by his father, Vincenzo. So maybe Galileo sort of got his rebellious nature from his father. Maybe it was sort of in his genes there. And Vincenzo is actually an important fellow in his own right. He writes down, this is Galileo's father, he writes down one of the first mathematical laws of physics. He was, remember, a lute player, and he wrote down an equation, one of the first mathematical equations of physics, that relates the frequency to the string tension. There, useful for a lute player. So Galileo is growing up. Remember, he's born in 1684. Now it's 64 rather, he's born. Now it's 1581. He's getting ready. He's thinking about college. And the Galileo family sits down around the dining room table and they say, be a doctor, my son. Why don't you be a doctor? You'll make a good living. You'll be respected in the community. And Galileo is a very good son. He enrolls in medical school at the University of Pisa, but he's completely bored by medicine. He's fascinated by mathematics, and he's tutored during this time by a man named Ostilio Ricci, who is the mathematician to the court of the Grand Dukes of Tuscany. And this is Galileo's first contact with the Medici princes. So during his time, his early years, Galileo invents a hydrostatic balance. You may remember the story of King Hero of Syracuse, who felt that the goldsmiths who made his crown had cheated him by replacing some of the gold in the crown with copper. And Archimedes, the great experimental physicist of antiquity, found a way of measuring the density of the crown, and found, in fact, that the goldsmith had cheated King Hero. And so Galileo, not for that reason, but Galileo admired, he was studying about Archimedes and he was studying mathematics, and he invents a gadget called a hydrostatic balance. And it's a gadget for measuring the density of materials. And so you put a sample on the cup at D here. I don't know if is my cursor visible to you here. You put a sample on the cup at D, and you move the sample along the arm of the balance until the balance balances, and then there's a scale on the arm of that balance. You can read out the density of the materials there. So at the time of Galileo there in the late 1500s, people thought that Dante's Inferno was a literal description of hell. And they tried to pick up clues from Dante's Inferno to figure out what the hell actually looked like. And about this time, towards the end of the 16th century, Galileo makes his first trip to Rome, and he's applying for a teaching job at the University of Bologna. Hang on here, let me make sure I'm staying on track. He doesn't get the job at the University of Bologna, but he makes some very good contacts there. And one of the contacts he makes is a man named Guidobaldo del Monte. Guidobaldo del Monte is the inspector of fortifications for the Grand Dukes of Tuscany. And Guidobaldo thinks that the hydrostatic balance is a very clever little gadget, and he thinks that Galileo is a clever guy. And so he recommends Galileo to Cardinal Francesco del Monte, and the cardinal invites Galileo to give a talk to the Florentine Academy on a mathematical subject, and Galileo chooses as his topic the dimensions of hell. The dimensions of hell. So here's in both the kind of all the fashionable descriptions of hell at that time, Lucifer is in the lowest circle of hell, near the center of the earth. He's encased in ice, and he's feeding sinners into his mouth. And there were two primary descriptions of hell that were popular at that time. One was by a Venetian by the name of Vellutello, and then there was one by a Florentine named Antonio Manetti. And Vellutello's hell, from what he gleaned from the Inferno, went from the center of the earth to about 1/10 of the way up to the surface of the earth. Manetti, also reading Dante's Inferno, felt that hell went almost to the very surface of the earth. And Galileo he's lecturing to a Florentine audience there in Tuscany, and he points out that Vellutello's hell is too small to hold all the sinners. So Manetti's hell must be the right description, you know. Galileo is pandering to his Florentine audience there, and his flattery works actually there. The flattery works, and the Medici princes appoint Galileo to a position at the University of Pisa, and he, let's see, his title is, well, I guess he's just a professor there. This is the same university that 4 years earlier had denied Galileo a scholarship. And now he's a professor at the University of Pisa here. So in some ways, maybe this shows you that it's important who you know as well as what you know. So Galileo is in Pisa, and while he's in Pisa, he starts his study of falling bodies, but he doesn't publish his work there, and he also starts helping his father with this equation, this mathematical law regarding the frequency of a string under tension there. But in 1590, Galileo's father dies, and Galileo is the oldest son. He has to assume responsibility for the family's finances, and Galileo has two younger sisters. He's going to have to pay dowries for them, and he has a younger brother who's also sort of a struggling musician, also named Vincenzo. A lot of Vincenzos in the story. And so this is the beginning of Galileo's money troubles. He's always behind in his payments. He's never making enough money, and he's always worried about money. So the job at Pisa is paying Galileo a low salary, and the academic climate in Pisa is Aristotelian. They teach Aristotle's natural philosophy, and the professors wear togas to class. And Galileo writes a little pamphlet called Capitolo contro il portare la toga, against the wearing of the gown. He says only doctors should wear gowns, not professors. He's ridiculing his colleagues at the University of Pisa. And of course, the colleagues don't like that, and they want him out. So he goes looking for another job there, and once again his friend Guido Baldo del Monte helps him out. And Galileo moves in 1592 to the University of Padua. So he's in Padua now. That's that little green bar on the timeline. And while he's there, the salary is much better. It's 3 times the salary that he was making in Pisa, but it's still not enough for Galileo. So he invents a gadget called the geometric and military compass. Now, this is a kind of mechanical calculator there. It can be used on the battlefield as a gunner's quadrant. It can take square roots and cube roots. It can do currency conversions. It can calculate compound interest there. And strangely, even though he's working at the University of Padua, Padua is part of the Venetian Republic. He dedicates the instruction book to Cosimo de' Medici, the Tuscan prince. And Padua is part of the Venetian Republic. Tuscany and the Medici and the Venetian Republic, they were sort of rivals at that time. But Galileo is flattering the Medici, he's flattering Cosimo, and he dedicates this device to Cosimo de' Medici. And this is part of, in a way, this device is part of the military-industrial complex, you know, beginning with Archimedes' catapult, continuing with this military compass, and right up on into the 20th century, science has been catering to the military-industrial complex for a long, long time. Began with Archimedes, continues with the compass and the telescope. So while he's in Padua in 1599, Galileo hires a housekeeper named by the name of Maria Gamba. He's 35 at the time, she's 21, and she becomes his housekeeper at first, then she becomes his mistress, and they have a child. They have first a child in 1600 named Virginia, and then a second daughter in 1601 by the name of Livia, and then they have a son, Vincenzo. So Galileo never married Marina, maybe because he felt his financial situation wasn't good enough to be married. But because the girls were illegitimate, Galileo's mother, Giulia Amananti, she wants them sent to the convent of San Matteo in Arcetri, near Florence, and they remain in the convent of San Matteo for the rest of their lives. Virginia takes the name of Sister Maria Celeste there. So Galileo's correspondence with his daughter is written about in the book Galileo's Daughter. If you haven't read this book, you should. It's a good read. And some authors have speculated that the reason that Galileo sent his daughters to the convent is so he wouldn't have to worry about their dowries. So the year is 1608 now, and in Holland, a man named Johann Lippershey invents a device he calls a device for seeing things far away. It's kind of hard to read the Dutch over here on the right, but actually above the picture there, you can make out Johann Lippershey's name there. And they deny his application for a patent because they say that it's much, much too easy to copy, to imitate this design. This is 1608. In 1609, a friend of Galileo's by the name of Paolo Sarpi is traveling in Holland, and he sends the details of the telescope to Galileo. And of course, Galileo immediately begins imitating Lippershey's design. And to be fair to Galileo, he improves the design. So there's one of Galileo's early telescopes. It has a 10 millimeter aperture and pretty poor glass quality. It's hard to see the glass quality here. You'll have to go to the Museo Galileo in Florence to see the glass quality. Maybe Galileo uses this device to take a look at the stars, but maybe he doesn't. But he realizes for sure that the telescope has military and commercial applications. So in 1609, Galileo and some of the Venetian senators go to the top of the Campanile. This is the Piazza del San Marco in Venice, and they take a look out at the sea. So here they are taking a look out at the sea. Galileo is usually shown with red hair. The guy in the funny hat looking through the telescope is the Doge of Venice. He's the ruler of Venice. And Galileo makes a present of his telescope to the Doge there. So, the Doge realizes that an astute trader, a commodities trader, can look out to sea far away, and he can see the flags on a ship coming into the port of Venice. And the flags on a ship typically show where the ship is coming from and what its cargo is. So an astute trader can get down to the docks as the ship puts into port and make a deal with the ship's captain. So the very first use of the telescope is not for astronomy, it's not for science, it's for maybe for insider trading. It's what we would call insider trading today. So Galileo now he's flattered the Doge. They double his salary, and they award him lifetime tenure there. So the next year, Galileo does point his telescope to the stars, and he writes the Sidereus Nuncius, the starry messenger. And there's several interesting things here. Again, he dedicates these, he calls these the Medician stars, the Medici stars. He's brown-nosing the Medici, and he's now promoted himself. If you look at the name here under his name, Galileo Galilei, he's now calling himself a patrician of Florence. And he says that he uses the word perspiculi for what he made his observations with. This means glasses. Perspiculi means glasses in Latin. The word telescope doesn't come into wide use for a couple of years later, but thereafter, starting maybe in about 1611, 1614, and later on, the people use the word telescope instead of perspiculi. But Galileo used the word perspiculi. It says telescope here, but that's really it's not a good translation. So let's see. The shameless brown-nosing works here. The Cosimo de' Medici II, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, is flattered by this, and they appoint Galileo chief mathematician and philosopher and mathematician to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. And Galileo was very specific about wanting to be called a natural philosopher. The word scientist the word science is used already, but the word scientist doesn't come into wide use for another 50 or more years. And so Galileo is appointed to be a philosopher to the Medici princes, and he doesn't have to do any teaching. So those of you who are in the academic world who might be listening to this, to have a lifetime appointment, to not have to do any teaching. Maybe you've been there, done that there. So Galileo returns to Florence in 1610, and his career from there is fairly familiar to us. Here's the his brown nosing of the Grand Dukes. He returns to Venice, to Florence rather, in 1610. And I'm going to skip most of the things that you already know about Galileo in this period, and I'm going to go right to the time preceding Galileo's death. And the year is 1633. He's working in Florence, and a painting is made of him by a Flemish painter by the name of Justus Sustermans. And this is probably the most common image of Galileo. If you read books about Galileo, this is often the picture that you'll see here. He's 69, 70 years old at this time, and he's kind of Galileo. I like using the word limbo for this description because limbo is the entrance to hell, and that's sort of Galileo's situation. Limbo is a way station for souls that haven't been condemned to damnation but aren't allowed yet to ascend to the heights. That's what Galileo is at this time. And at this time, his trial in Rome was in 1633, and part of his the sentence of the trial was that as a penance, we impose on you to recite the 7 penitential psalms once a week for 3 years. Doesn't sound like too bad of a punishment, I think, but Galileo doesn't even do that. He has his daughter Virginia recite the psalms for him. And but sadly for him, Virginia dies in late 1634, and after that, his son Vincenzo takes care of Galileo and recites the Psalms for him. So, by this time, Galileo in the late 1630s, Galileo is an international celebrity, and the myth making has begun here. He's portrayed as the first natural philosopher to back his theories with observation. He's portrayed as the first modern scientist, and he's portrayed as a martyr of science, a victim of persecution by the backward and heavy-handed Catholic Church. Well, we know today that the situation is a little more complicated than that, but he's become famous. His works are widely published and circulated outside of Italy, and his fame grows as other people duplicate his observations there. So he continues working and writing, observing the moon until he goes completely blind in 1637 there. And Milton is one of the people who visits him, and Milton writes about this in Paradise Lost there. So now in 1639, a man named Vincenzo Viviani becomes Galileo's last student there. Viviani is 17 at the time, and he spends the rest of his life advocating for Galileo's place in history. So in January of 1642, Galileo is on his deathbed. He's almost 78 years old, and he dies still in limbo, still under censure by the church. And here's Viviani in the red tunic there at the right. And Galileo's will states that he should be buried in the Santa Croce Church with his father and his ancestors. And so the next day, his body is furtively taken by Viviani and a few close friends to the Santa Croce Church, and it's put in a side chapel of the Santa Croce Church called the Chapel of the Novitiates, and this is the private chapel of the Medici princes there. The current Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1637 is a man named Ferdinando, and he has a younger brother, Leopoldo. They were tutored in mathematics by Galileo when they were young, and they admired Galileo. They wanted to build an elaborate tomb for Galileo in the Santa Croce Church opposite the tomb of Michelangelo, but the church wouldn't allow it. So Galileo lies in this temporary tomb in the Chapel of the Novitiates for 95 years. So here he is in the Chapel of the Novitiates here. He's in the Santa Croce Church, but he's in this little sort of side chapel there. Now you might think this is the end of the story with the death of Galileo, but you'd be wrong. The story is starting to get interesting here, and the chapter that I just talked about is called The Birth of Galileo. And what I mean by that is it's the birth of the Galilean myth. And the next chapter is the story of Galileo after death. And the main player in this story is Viviani. Viviani, he achieved some notoriety in his day as a physicist and a mathematician. In life was advocating for Galileo. And every now and then he would remind the Medici princes, his Viviani, he would write a letter to them and say, gee, you really ought to do something special for Galileo. You ought to make a grand tomb for him in the Santa Croce Church there. But this doesn't happen. The Catholic Church still forbids it. So Viviani, rather, in the 1650s begins writing his magnum opus called The Life of Galileo, the definitive work on Galileo. And he writes from the 1650s until Viviani dies in 1703. And he writes a lot of things in his definitive work there, like the dropping of the apple, the dropping of the weights from the Leaning Tower, the swinging lamp in the Pisa Cathedral, that are probably fabrications, just like the story of Newton and the apple there. And he realizes, Viviani realizes about 1690, that a monumental tomb for Galileo in the Santa Croce Church probably isn't going to happen anytime soon. So he leaves a trust fund for the building of this, and he also purchases a villa in Florence, in downtown Florence, called the Palace of the Scrolls. And on this village, it's on, let's see, it's on the Via San Antonio in Florence. He has a bust of Galileo and scrolls which detail all of Galileo's accomplishments in life. If you're interested, this is a place you should visit, but don't try to bring a car into Florence. It's impossible to park there. If you can't find parking there, your car may be broken into and have things stolen from it. I know about this personally there. So in 1703 now, Viviani dies, and his corpse is placed in the Chapel of the Novitiates with Galileo. He has a nephew administering this trust fund to build a monumental tomb for Galileo. The nephew dies, and then another nephew takes over as trustee of the trust. But no tomb is authorized in the Santa Croce Church. The nephew keeps advocating for this. Finally, a tomb is authorized in 1734, and it's completed. And the ceremony of moving Galileo's remains takes place on March 12, 1737 at 6 p.m. And that is the anniversary of the date in 1564 when the remains of Michelangelo were taken to Santa Croce and buried in the Santa Croce Church. The Galileistas, that is the people who were members of the cult of Galileo, they wanted to keep alive this parallel between Michelangelo and Galileo, both of whom had their troubles with the church. So at 1737, they're going to move the body. A notary is hired to record the reinterment ceremony. Of people who are sympathetic to Galileo are invited. And this reinterment of Galileo in the Santa Croce Church is a political statement, as well as a reburial of an admired figure there. This time the Medici princes were trying to free Tuscany from the control of the Catholic Church. And the statement of burying Galileo in the Santa Croce Church, Galileo is a heretic. It's a kind of a political statement by the Medici in this battle of freeing Tuscany from the control of the church. So this is what the facade of the Catholic Church looks like today. It was designed in about 1863 by an architect named Niccolo Matus. Niccolo Matus was a Jewish architect. You can see that he has cleverly worked a Star of David into the facade of the church. It's a beautiful facade, actually. Matus wanted to be buried in the church, but because he was Jewish, the church wouldn't allow it. And Matus is actually buried in the steps under the entrance to the church there. So here's the nave of the. So here, this is what the Santa Croce Church looked like in 1737 when they're burying Galileo. I'm going to go back here. You can see the bell tower in the back. Here it is in 1737 there. And I'd like to take you on that walk through the Santa Croce Church. Here's the nave of the church. We go down the nave of the church and we continue all the way down just to the right past the altar. You know, the national pastime of Italy is not soccer, it's restoring old churches. You can see they were doing, when I took this picture, they were restoring the front of the church here. So we go down past the altar, we make a right turn, and we go past Michelangelo's tomb. Michelangelo's tomb has three sculptures representing sculpture, three statues on it rather representing sculpture, architecture, and painting. We come to a little corridor beyond the altar. We go up a set of stairs and we go into the chapel of the novitiates here. And here we are. Here's the chapel of the novitiates. It's all lit with candles and there are witnesses gathered around. And there's a little side room where Galileo's coffin has laid there. And everyone gathers around. And first Viviani's out. And it's identified by a lead plaque on the coffin. It says this is the... And they move Viviani's coffin to the grand tomb in the Santa Croce Church. And but then they look and there are two more coffins in this room. And the Galileos this puts a little panic into the Galileos. You know, suppose you had two coffins. Suppose you threw a party for someone and the guest of honor didn't show up, or you weren't sure who the guest of honor was. They were kind of worried about what might be in those two coffins. And they open up one of the first coffins, and it has a broken lid, and it has the remains of an old man. The skeleton is in very bad shape. It's in pieces. The jawbone contains only 4 teeth, and worse, there's no identification whatsoever on the coffin. Not on the skeleton, not on the clothing, and they're worried about this. They open up the second coffin. The second coffin contains the body of a woman who died a long time ago. So, okay, now they're pretty sure that the top coffin contains Galileo's remains. There's no confusion. And they try to identify the remains of that are in that first coffin. And some years later, and this is 1737 rather, in 1740, a man who was at the ceremony writes, the face of the corpse had been extremely well preserved and very closely resembles a bust made by Caccini in 1610 and the Sisterman paintings. This is what I call imaginative recall, because no one alive in 1740 or 1737 had ever seen Galileo. So here are the two tombs here. Here's Galileo's tomb. In a concession to the church, Galileo's tomb has only 2 statues, geometry and astronomy, and Michelangelo's has 3. I don't know which is grander, Galileo's, Michelangelo's, I don't know, and it probably doesn't matter there. So they're about to move the body into the grand tomb now, and before they do, an amazing thing happens. They use a knife and they take out 3 of Galileo's fingers and a vertebrae and a tooth from the corpse. So today the middle finger is in the Museo Galileo in Florence. The vertebrae is in a collection of the University of Padua, and the thumb and the index finger and the tooth went into private collections, but over time the family that had these forgot what they were. So with this gruesome story, Galileo's body, Galileo's burial is complete, and you might think the story ends here, but it doesn't. So Venice is Florence rather is a lovely city to see. Everyone wants to see the statue of David in the Accademia Museum. They want to see Botticelli's Venus Rising in the Uffizi, and they want to see the statue, the monumental statue of Neptune in the Piazza della Signoria. These are must-see things in Galileo, in the city of Florence here. But around the corner from the Uffizi, here's the Piazza della Signoria. The Accademia Museum is kind of up above this. The open space is where the statue of Neptune is. The Uffizi Gallery is shown on the map here. And but around the corner on the river is the Museo Galileo. And it used to be called the Museum of the History of Science. I took this picture in 2002. But I guess they figured that the Galileo was a better brand name than the Museum of the History of Science. It's now called the Museo Galileo. And they have one of Galileo's telescopes there, and they have his middle finger there in the Galileo Museum. It's very strange. So during his life, Galileo never traveled farther than from Florence to Rome, Florence to Venice. These are distances of about 175, 200 miles. But in death, in 2009, Galileo's finger traveled 4,000 miles to Philadelphia. You may remember 2009 was the International Year of Astronomy, and Galileo's finger traveled all the way to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. They were having seminars and presentations about Galileo, and Galileo's finger was in the Franklin Institute for a year. And things get even stranger later on in 2009. There's a man named Alberto Bruschi, and he and his daughter are attending an auction in Florence, and they're buying 19th century reliquaries. Reliquaries are little boxes that hold the remains of saints. And Candida Bruschi, is a very religious woman, but she knows the story of Galileo's reburial, and she notices that one of the reliquaries has a bas relief carved on its surface, and it resembles Galileo, and she buys the reliquary, and she finds that the reliquary has 2 fingers and a tooth in it. She takes the box to the Museo Galileo, and sure enough, the director of the museum identifies the artifacts as Galileo's missing thumb and index finger, and a dental surgeon verifies the age of the tooth, and he concludes that Galileo ground his teeth while sleeping. Now, I bet you that's a fact about Galileo that none of you knew, that Galileo ground his teeth while he was sleeping. And you might think that the story ends here, but it doesn't. It doesn't. So in 2000, the first time I gave this talk was in 2011, and at the time I corresponded with the director of the Museo Galileo. There's a man named Paolo Galuzzi, and a lot of this talk is based on Professor Galuzzi's essay in the Cambridge Companion to Galileo there. And Professor Galuzzi had applied for permission to exhume the remains in Galileo's tomb. He wanted to take DNA samples. He wants to verify that the 2 bodies buried in the tomb along with Galileo are Viviani and Virginia, Galileo's daughter. And he'd like to determine, by looking at Galileo's eye sockets, perhaps they can tell what caused Galileo to go blind. Now, we think that the reason that Galileo went blind was because he looked at the sun without proper eye protection, but we're not sure of that. So a request for exhuming a coffin in the Santa Croce Church has to clear a lot of obstacles. It has to clear the church, of course, local authorities, national authorities. But in 2011, Professor Galuzzi thought that it might be possible to exhume Galileo's remains in 2013. And you might think the story ends there, but it doesn't. When I first gave this talk, at the end of the talk, I said, stay tuned. So here's an update here. In the 2013 issue of Smithsonian magazine, there was an article about the Italian forensic pathologist, a man by the name of Gino Fornaciari. He's in the medical school at the University of Pisa, and he's exhumed and examined the bodies of Medici princes, of the Aragonese nobles of Naples, and other Renaissance figures that he's made discoveries about their lives and about their deaths there. And he teamed with Paolo Galuzzi to request the permission to exhume Galileo's remains. But the request draws a firestorm of criticism there. Everybody, scholars, media critics, clergymen, they refer to Galuzzi and Fornaciari as grave robbers. The rector of the Santa Croce Church says this is a carnivalata, a carnival stunt. And Fornaciari is sort of stunned by this. He thinks it's a legitimate line of scientific inquiry. And there's an Italian historian of science by the name of, I gotta get this right, Pier Giorgio Odifreddi. He writes in the Italian national newspaper La Repubblica, he says, let Galileo rest in peace. But my own opinion is, I think that if Galileo knew that 380 years after his death, he would still be making news, I think the old boy would be pretty pleased. Our friend Galileo was nothing if not a shameless self-promoter. He was a great scientist, but he was also a great self-promoter. Now, last year I wrote to the current director of the Museo Galileo to see if this project was progressing, but their comment was no comment. So now this is really the end of my talk, but I'm gonna end with the same ending that I gave in 2011, and that ending is stay tuned. Okay, thanks for your attention there. And we can talk about Galileo. I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Michael, it was a great talk. Thank you very much. I would invite everyone, you can turn on your microphones and please, questions, anyone?
So I might point out that there's one person who's part of this Zoom group who knows a lot more about Galileo than I know, and who has, in fact, an original copy of Siderius Nuncius.
Ooh.
There. He's looking down right now. He's not, do you have your copy of Siderius Nuncius, Andy? You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I have a question. In all of the talk and in all of your history of science in Italy, the name of Leonardo da Vinci was not mentioned, and I wonder why not. Was it that he came from the wrong town?
I don't know. You know, in researching this, Peter, I don't know.
Well, I just looked up his birth and death dates, and da Vinci is 1452 to 1519, so he's more than a century before Galileo, and certainly equally, if not more celebrated, and an artist. And I expect, as we talk about the history of science and art in Italy, we cannot neglect Mr. da Vinci.
Well, I think you're right, but I'm pandering to a Florentine audience here.
Okay.
Just a quick question. Such great storytelling, and you have such a verve of making an interesting story. I've got to know, was at one point in the past your name used to be Bertini?
No, actually, no. If you really want to know, my ancestors are immigrants from what I believe is now part of Belarus, and I never remember if it's Minsk or Pinsk. And when they arrived at Ellis Island in the 1890s, the family name was Bertsinski. And the immigration officer at Ellis Island said, Bertsinski, I don't like that name. He said, in the United States, your name is going to be Bertin.
I think Bertini might have been a better story.
Well, Bertin is the spelling of our family name is very unusual. Of course, most Bertins are spelled B-U-R-T-O-N, like Richard Burton. But if you go to Paris, there are pages and pages in the Paris telephone book of Bertins. There are just hundreds and thousands of Bertins. In France, the founder of the Olympics is Baron de Coubertin. So in Paris, Bertin is a kind of a common name. I'm sort of, people are always misspelling my name.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, but I don't mind. I don't mind it.
Great
Okay,
story. Great storytelling.
Yeah, did you have a question for me, Mike? I just found the unmute.
Jay, where did you get your copy of Siderius Nuncius?
There was an auction in London, and I forget whether it was Christie's or Sotheby's. I think it was Christie's. I could look that up easily. And I heard about it. I knew that Siderius Nuncius came up very seldom, so I actually sent. The only time I've ever actually sent somebody to an auction, or especially in Europe, to bid on it. And
wow.
So it's got an original binding, and you can use a little thing, but we don't want to really touch the binding. And it's a nice copy.
Send it.
Where do you keep it, Jay? Where do you keep it?
Well, I have, we actually just had some people from Christie's going through the whole collection for another insurance evaluation. And it's kept in a vault. When Williams College built its library building in 1920, they got a big back vault. And so these things are what's called on deposit with Williams College. They're just holding it for me, but it gets locked up in a fireproof
And get whatever Williams.
Oh, right. I guess I knew that. Yeah. In
And
history?
I am again teaching my rare books course in the fall. It's called Great Astronomers and Their. And so it's a seminar for a dozen people, though it's oversubscribed by a factor of 2. And we meet on Wednesday afternoons. Each week is a topic, and we have several books out. One week is Galileo, one week is Newton. Kepler is a favorite. And in fact, the first time I taught it, I wasn't sure whether anybody would take it. So I wanted to mention Shakespeare, which everybody had heard of. So 2 of my colleagues, including my graduate school colleague, Peter, have written books on Shakespeare's science, including a lot of Shakespeare's astronomical references. I recommend both those books. The other one is a Canadian journalist called Dan Falk, and so we do open with Shakespeare's astronomy. And though I don't, this is the only session in which none of the books that I own are there, but our rare book library at Williams College, the Chapin Library, owns a first folio, a second folio,
Leave.
third folios, and a fourth folio.
I'm going to leave and bring us food.
Okay, bye.
Want to continue?
No, I'm going to leave.
Turn it off.
But anyway, I've just been referring, I was just asked to do a book well, a chapter on Galileo, and a quick study for Physics Today on sunspots. So I'm including an illustration, if they find room for it, from Galileo's sunspot book of 1613. So pretty soon after he got his telescope going, he worked out a way of projecting sunspot images. They're quite detailed. And in fact, there was a movie a dozen years ago called Solar Max that I recommend, and for which we made a video of the couple of dozen sunspot diagrams, full-page drawings by Galileo. And you can see the rotation of the sun. So that was another early discovery that tends to get overlooked by excessive concentration on the moons of Jupiter.
Well, that ties us back to Palomar Observatory, because George Ellery Hale, of course, was a solar astronomer.
Well, I'll send you the piece I made. I made mention, of course, of George Ellery Hale, because he is responsible for finding the magnetic field, or finding that sunspots are magnetic. So in fact, I'm going to Stellafane, if you know what that is. It's sort of amateur convention the day before with a little more technical stuff that I'm giving a more or less a spectroscopic talk. So I've been pulling out George Ellery Hale references for that.
Are there other questions? Anyone, please? Step right in, step right in.
Okay, let me make a comment. Mike, you said that Galileo was convicted of heresy. Actually, he was convicted of something else. It's called vehement suspicion of heresy. Now, only canon lawyers can, or even modern lawyers maybe, can figure out, all the levels of this. But I'll give you one example of vehement suspicion of heresy. You're playing golf on Sunday rather than showing up in church. Why is he doing this? Maybe he's a heretic. So, I mean, it was a very conditional kind of thing. And there are lots of problems with the mechanics of the trial, and a lot has been written about it. But the one thing I've always been curious about are the conditions of his house arrest, because he had a lot of supporters. They knew they had a VIP on their hands. And I'm pretty sure that they must not have had an armed guard at the door all the time, or even a Dominican with a key, the way that picture with Milton shows. I've always been curious about that. I haven't found a word written about it.
Well, everybody comes to visit him from all over Europe. If they're traveling in northern Italy, they go to see Galileo. Just the way if we're traveling in Europe, we go to see the Eiffel Tower.
Mike, you showed a picture in your talk of Santa Croce before the 19th century facade was built, and you said that this is how it looked in 17 something or other. And that was before there were cameras. So what, in fact, was that picture?
I don't remember the source of that particular picture, but I'm guessing it was probably a painting.
Mike,
But I'm not sure.
it's my understanding that it wasn't that long ago that the church actually forgave Galileo. You didn't mention that at all in your talk.
Yeah. Well, I tried to keep this talk under 45, 47 minutes, Steve. So a lot of people gave me good suggestions, actually, about things to include. But I just, I felt that I got a lot of good genes from my parents, but I didn't get the brevity gene from them. So whenever I write a talk, it's always too long, and I'm always sort of struggling to cut it down so that it fits into the time allotted. I'm getting a signal even now that I'm talking too much from my wife. Those of you who know my wife, uh, you might know that we have a particular signal there. And yes, the people who know me well are giving this signal. It means, shut up, Michael.
Anyway, again, the church technically didn't apologize or forgive Galileo, but they said that they shouldn't have done it. But the Pope said that, but there was no actual apology. But the vehemently suspected of heresy is 100% correct, and I remember that. So we must be careful. I did, in my background on my picture, put up one of Galileo's pages with sunspots from his book of 1613. So somebody could look at it.
Wow.
So Michael, I'm curious, do you think that there's any modern day equivalents to the orthodoxies that that Galileo was questioning? And he was a maverick at the time. What would you say is the thing that the scientific consensus is, so strongly held that it can't really be doubted without kind of pushing yourself to be ridiculed and pushed aside in the scientific community?
Well, there are, long ago, when I was a practicing physicist, I attended a seminar. It was actually probably not that long ago, probably within the last 20 years. I attended an American Physical Society meeting, and someone was questioning the way we use Galileo's moons. I can't remember the details. We use something about the way the moons operate to do timing. And someone was questioning the validity of using this method, and there was a firestorm of criticism for questioning this method. So these, people still sort of like to rely on the weight of authority when they're presenting whatever it is that they're presenting. I, for example, relied on the weight of authority of Paolo Galuzzi's essay.
Actually, the nautical almanacs at various times have used the timing of Jupiter's moons as a way to verify time. It has been done, and it's been used popularly for practical purposes.
Other questions? Michael, great presentation, great discussion. Is there anything else, any points anybody wants to bring up before we adjourn the meeting? Well, with that, then, again, Michael, thank you. And let me give a note on our next meeting. The Greenway Talks online will continue on Saturday, January 23rd. Caltech PhD candidate Mike Recklick McCannon has been using the wide field infrared camera on the 200-inch telescope to observe the dimming that takes place when exoplanets transit their host stars. Precision light curves he has obtained contain information about the formation, evolution, and habitability of exoplanets. In this presentation, Mike will show us how the Hale telescope is helping support research that is extending our knowledge of exoplanets and of the universe. So, Mike Bertin, again, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who showed up today, everyone who came to the Greenway Talks. I appreciate your support and participation. And with that, I'll close the meeting. And we'll see you again on July 23rd. Everybody, Bye-bye. Thank you again.